This is my true story. I've been living with my son since my wife died last year. 3 weeks ago, I couldn't sleep and noticed something strange. My daughter-in-law Lisa's car was always pulling out of the driveway at 2 in the morning with her headlights off. My son worked brutal hours and slept heavily. He had no idea his wife was disappearing in the middle of the night. Last Thursday, I followed her. What I discovered destroyed my son's life. Before that, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And please subscribe to this channel so that my stories can reach more people. From the moment my son Marcus introduced me to Lisa 3 years ago, something felt wrong about her. I couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was. She seemed nice enough on the surface. She was polite and well-dressed and said all the right things. But something in my gut told me this woman wasn't what she appeared to be. Maybe it was father's intuition. Maybe it was just years of life experience teaching me to recognize fake people. Whatever it was, I didn't trust her from day one. Lisa was too polished, too perfect. Everything about her seemed calculated and rehearsed. The way she dressed in expensive designer clothes, the way she spoke in this overly formal professional tone, the way she smiled, but it never quite reached her eyes. She reminded me of a salesperson trying to close a deal. She was selling herself to Marcus and to me, trying to convince us she was the perfect woman. But I could see through it. What bothered me most was how interested she seemed in Marcus's business success. Within the first hour of meeting her, she'd already asked multiple questions about his company. What kind of business did he own? How many employees? What were his annual revenues? How fast was the company growing? She framed these questions casually, like she was just making conversation. But I noticed the pattern. She was gathering information about his finances. She also mentioned his wealth constantly in casual conversation. She'd say things like, "Marcus was telling me about the new office building he just bought," or, "I love that Marcus is so successful and ambitious." She always found ways to bring up money or property or business achievements. Normal people don't do that. When you're genuinely interested in someone, you talk about their personality or their hobbies or their values, not their bank account. Marcus had built a very successful tech consulting firm over the previous 10 years. He'd started it from nothing right after college, worked brutal hours, sacrificed his social life, poured everything into building this company. By the time he met Lisa, his firm was worth about $8 million. He employed 30 people. He had major corporate clients. He was genuinely successful, and Lisa could smell the money. They dated for 6 months before Marcus announced they were engaged. 6 months. That's barely enough time to really know someone. I'd been married to Marcus's mother for 40 years before she passed. I knew what real relationships looked like. They took time. They went through struggles. They built slowly. But Marcus was in his early 30s and had been so focused on his business, he hadn't dated much. Lisa was the first serious relationship he'd had. He was completely blinded by it. I tried to voice my concerns when he told me about the engagement. I said things like, "Are you sure you know her well enough?" And, "What's the rush? Why not date longer?" But Marcus got defensive immediately. He said I was being an overprotective father. He said I'd never approve of anyone he dated. He said I needed to trust his judgment. He accused me of not wanting him to be happy. So I backed off. I didn't want to damage my relationship with my son by pushing too hard. The wedding happened about a year after they met. It was expensive and elaborate. Lisa insisted on a huge event with 200 guests at some fancy venue. Marcus paid for all of it. I stood there in my suit, watching my son marry this woman while every instinct I had screamed that this was a mistake. But I smiled and congratulated them. I gave a toast at the reception saying all the expected father of the groom things. Inside, I was praying I was wrong about her. After the wedding, Lisa's true nature started showing more clearly. She immediately began pressuring Marcus to upgrade their lifestyle. They'd been living in a nice 3-bedroom house. Lisa wanted a mansion. Marcus bought one. She wanted a Mercedes. Marcus bought it. She wanted expensive vacations to Europe. Marcus paid for them. She treated his wealth like her personal unlimited credit card. Marcus was working himself to exhaustion while Lisa spent his money freely. Lisa also started isolating Marcus from his family and friends. She'd make excuses why they couldn't come to family dinners. She'd schedule conflicts when I invited them to visit. She'd complain that Marcus's old friends were beneath them now, and pressure him to only socialize with wealthier people. I watched my son's social circle shrink to just Lisa and people she approved of. It's a classic manipulation tactic. Cut someone off from their support system so you have more control. Marcus was working longer hours than ever. He'd leave for the office at 7 in the morning and often didn't come home until 9 or 10 at night. He was constantly stressed about meeting client demands and growing the business. Meanwhile, Lisa wasn't working at all. She'd quit her job as a marketing coordinator right after the wedding. She claimed she wanted to be a full-time wife and manage their home. But mostly, she just spent money and posted photos on social media of her luxurious lifestyle. I stayed silent about most of this. I didn't want to be the interfering parent. I didn't want Marcus to accuse me of meddling in his marriage. I hoped maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe Lisa would settle down once the newlywed phase ended. Maybe she genuinely loved Marcus, and I was just seeing problems that weren't there. But deep down, I knew something was very wrong with this marriage. I just didn't know how wrong until that night I couldn't sleep. After Marcus and Lisa got married, the red flags I'd noticed during their dating period became impossible to ignore. Lisa's behavior got progressively worse as she became more comfortable in her role as Marcus's wife. The polished facade she'd maintained while they were dating started cracking. Her true personality emerged, and it wasn't pretty. She became demanding and entitled and completely focused on spending as much of Marcus's money as possible. The constant pressure for lifestyle upgrades was relentless. Nothing was ever good enough for Lisa. Marcus had bought them a beautiful 4-bedroom house in a great neighborhood, but Lisa insisted they needed something bigger and more impressive. So Marcus sold that house at a loss because they'd only owned it for 8 months. Then he bought a 6-bedroom mansion in the most expensive part of town. The new house cost $3 million, way more than they needed for just 2 people. But even the mansion wasn't enough. Lisa immediately started renovating. She hired expensive interior designers. She replaced perfectly good furniture with custom pieces that cost tens of thousands of dollars. She redid the kitchen, even though it was already modern and updated. She wanted marble countertops and professional-grade appliances. She spent $300,000 on renovations within the first year. Marcus paid for all of it without complaint. The car situation was similar. Lisa had been driving a decent Toyota when Marcus met her. After the wedding, she decided that car wasn't appropriate for someone of her new status. She needed a luxury vehicle. So Marcus bought her a Mercedes. Not just any Mercedes, but a top-of-the-line model that cost $90,000. Lisa drove it around town like she was showing off her trophy. Like the expensive car proved she'd married well and was living the life she deserved. The vacations were another massive expense. Lisa insisted they take elaborate international trips several times a year. She wanted to go to Paris and London and Dubai and the Maldives. She booked 5-star hotels and first-class flights. She'd spend thousands on shopping while they were traveling. Each vacation cost $30,000 to $50,000. Marcus was working himself to death to fund this lifestyle, while Lisa treated their money like it was infinite. What really bothered me was that Lisa wasn't contributing anything financially. She'd quit her job immediately after the wedding, claiming she wanted to focus on being a wife and creating a beautiful home. But she wasn't doing traditional housewife duties either. They had a housekeeper who came 3 times a week. They had a chef who prepared meals. They had a gardener and a pool service. Lisa wasn't cooking or cleaning or maintaining anything. She was just spending money and posting photos on social media. Lisa also became increasingly controlling of Marcus's time and relationships. She didn't like him spending time with his old friends. She'd complain they were bad influences or immature or not successful enough. She wanted Marcus to only associate with wealthy business owners and executives, people who matched the image she wanted to project. Marcus's longtime friends from college gradually stopped coming around because Lisa made them feel unwelcome. She did the same thing with family. I'd invite Marcus and Lisa over for dinner, and Lisa would always have some excuse why they couldn't come. She was too tired or had other plans or wasn't feeling well. But then I'd see on social media that same night she was out at expensive restaurants with her own friends. She was deliberately keeping Marcus away from me and the rest of his family. Classic isolation tactics that abusers and manipulators use. Marcus's work hours became insane during this time. He was leaving the house at 6 or 7 in the morning and often not coming home until 10 or 11 at night. Sometimes he'd work weekends too. When I asked him about it, he said business was growing and he needed to put in the hours to maintain their success. But I suspected Lisa's spending was putting pressure on him to make more money. The mansion and the Mercedes and the vacations weren't cheap. He needed to work constantly just to fund her lifestyle. Marcus looked exhausted whenever I saw him. He'd lost weight. He had dark circles under his eyes. He seemed stressed and anxious all the time. I tried talking to him about maybe slowing down or taking better care of his health, but he'd brush me off saying he was fine. He'd say this was just what it took to run a successful business. He didn't seem to realize his wife's spending was the real problem. Meanwhile, Lisa seemed to be thriving. She looked great. She was always perfectly dressed and made up. She spent her days at the gym and the spa and having lunch with her friends. She wasn't working or stressed or exhausted. She was living her best life, funded entirely by Marcus's brutal work schedule. She treated marriage like winning the lottery. She'd found a successful man, and now she could live in luxury without having to work for it herself. Marcus owned a successful tech consulting firm that he'd built from scratch over 10 years. The company was worth approximately $8 million. It employed 30 people. It had major corporate clients. This was Marcus's life work. Everything he'd sacrificed and struggled for. And Lisa treated his company like her personal bank account. She spent his money as fast as he could make it without any appreciation for the work it took to earn. I wanted to say something. I wanted to sit Marcus down and tell him his wife was using him, that she was draining his finances and his energy and his health, that this marriage was destroying him. But I stayed silent because I didn't want to be the interfering parent. I didn't want Marcus to accuse me of trying to control his life or ruin his marriage. I hoped maybe things would improve. Maybe Lisa would mature. Maybe Marcus would set boundaries. But things only got worse. I've been living in the guest house on Marcus's property since my wife died last year. Marcus had insisted I move in after her funeral. He said he didn't want me living alone. He said the guest house was just sitting empty and I should use it. It's a nice setup. A small cottage about 50 yards behind the main mansion. It has a bedroom and bathroom and small kitchen. Enough space for an old man like me. Close enough to my son that I can see him regularly, but separate enough that we both have privacy. The guest house has windows that face toward the main house. From my bedroom, I can see their driveway and the front entrance. During the day, I'd sometimes watch Marcus leave for work in the morning. I'd see Lisa's Mercedes coming and going as she ran her errands or met friends for lunch. At night, their house would go dark around 10 or 11. Marcus worked such long hours, he was usually exhausted by bedtime. I assumed they were both sleeping peacefully through the night. 3 weeks ago, I had a terrible night of insomnia. It's something that happens more frequently as I've gotten older. My mind races, my body aches. I can't get comfortable. I lie in bed for hours, unable to fall asleep. That particular night, I'd been tossing and turning since 10 o'clock. By midnight, I gave up trying to sleep. I got up and made myself some tea. I sat in my bedroom reading, trying to tire my brain out enough to sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I heard a sound that caught my attention. A car engine starting. It was quiet because the night was so still, but I definitely heard it. I looked out my bedroom window toward the main house. Lisa's Mercedes was backing out of the driveway. I could see her silhouette in the driver's seat, but something strange caught my attention immediately. Her headlights were off. She was backing out of the driveway in complete darkness. I watched as she reached the street. Only then did she turn her headlights on. Then she drove away down the street, disappearing into the night. I looked at my watch. It was exactly 2:14 in the morning. What was Lisa doing leaving the house at that hour? Where could she possibly be going? The behavior struck me as extremely suspicious. If she had some legitimate emergency or errand, why would she leave with her headlights off? That's what someone does when they're trying to sneak away without being noticed. I stayed at my window for a while, wondering if she'd come back quickly. Maybe she'd forgotten something at a store. Maybe she was making a late-night food run. But an hour passed, and she didn't return. I eventually went back to bed, but couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. Why was Marcus's wife sneaking out of their house in the middle of the night? And more importantly, did Marcus know she was doing this? I didn't see Lisa return that night. I eventually fell asleep around 4 in the morning. When I woke up the next day around 8, her Mercedes was back in the driveway. Everything looked normal. The house looked peaceful, like nothing unusual had happened. I thought about mentioning it to Marcus but decided not to. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe I'd misunderstood what I saw. I didn't want to cause problems in their marriage over what might be nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The image of her car backing out with the lights off kept replaying in my mind. That's not normal behavior. That's sneaky behavior. That's what someone does when they're hiding something. I started paying more attention to the main house at night. I started staying up later watching from my window. I wanted to see if it happened again. 3 nights later, I had insomnia again. This was a Thursday night. I was sitting in my bedroom around 1:30 in the morning reading. I kept glancing out the window toward the main house. Around 2 o'clock, I saw movement. Lisa's Mercedes was backing out of the driveway again. Headlights off just like before. She drove to the street, turned her lights on, and drove away. I checked my watch. 2:14 a.m., the exact same time as before. This was no coincidence. Lisa was deliberately leaving the house at the same time in the middle of the night, and she was doing it secretly with her lights off so Marcus wouldn't notice from inside the house. I felt sick to my stomach. This could only mean one thing. She was meeting someone. She was having an affair. My gut instinct about this woman had been right all along. She'd never loved Marcus. She'd married him for his money, and now she was cheating on him. I sat by my window and waited to see when she'd return. 2 hours passed. At exactly 4:14 in the morning, her Mercedes pulled back into the driveway. Headlights off again as she approached the house. She parked and went inside quietly. The house stayed dark. Marcus was clearly still asleep. He had no idea his wife had just spent 2 hours out of the house in the middle of the night. He was working himself to death during the day and sleeping heavily at night while his wife was sneaking around behind his back. I knew I needed to tell Marcus what I'd seen, but I also knew he wouldn't believe me without proof. He was so in love with Lisa, so trusting. He'd think I was being a paranoid old man who didn't like his wife. He'd think I was trying to cause problems. I needed evidence. I needed to know for certain what Lisa was doing during those 2-hour disappearances. So I decided to start tracking her movements more carefully. After seeing Lisa leave the house at 2 in the morning twice, I decided I needed to watch more carefully. I needed to know if this was a regular pattern or just random occurrences. So I started deliberately staying awake at night. I'd go to bed around 10 like normal, but I'd set an alarm on my phone for 1:30 in the morning. When the alarm went off, I'd get up and position myself by my bedroom window with a clear view of their driveway. The first night I did this was a Monday. I sat by my window from 1:30 until 3 in the morning. Nothing happened. Lisa's Mercedes stayed in the driveway. The house stayed dark. I felt foolish sitting there watching my son's house like some kind of stalker. Maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe those 2 times I'd seen her leave were just coincidences. Maybe she'd had legitimate reasons for going out that I didn't understand. But then Tuesday night came. I set my alarm again for 1:30. I got up and took my position by the window. Right at 2 o'clock, I saw movement. Lisa's Mercedes backing out of the driveway. Headlights off. She reached the street, turned the lights on, drove away. I checked my watch. 2:14 a.m. Exactly the same time as the previous times I'd witnessed this. This wasn't random. This was deliberate and scheduled. I decided to wait and see when she returned. I made myself coffee to stay awake. I sat by the window watching and waiting. 2 hours passed slowly. At 4:14 in the morning, her Mercedes pulled back into the driveway. Headlights off as she approached the house. She parked. She went inside quietly. Everything went back to looking normal. Like nothing had happened. Like she'd been home sleeping all night. Wednesday night I watched again. Nothing happened. The car stayed in the driveway all night. Thursday night I watched. At 2 a.m. sharp, Lisa's car backed out. Headlights off, same routine. She was gone for exactly 2 hours, returned at 4:14. Friday night nothing happened. Saturday night at 2 a.m. she left again. Same pattern, same timing. She was gone for 2 hours and returned at 4:14. After watching for 2 full weeks, the pattern became crystal clear. Lisa was leaving the house every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday night. Always at exactly 2 a.m. Always with her headlights off until she reached the street. Always gone for exactly 2 hours. Always returning at 4:14 a.m. The consistency was damning. This wasn't random trips or emergencies. This was a scheduled routine. She was meeting someone on a regular basis. I thought about what could explain this behavior. What innocent reason would someone have for leaving their house at 2 in the morning 3 times per week? I couldn't think of any. Normal people don't have regular appointments at 2 a.m. Stores aren't open, gyms aren't open, restaurants aren't open. The only thing that makes sense at that hour is meeting someone you don't want others to know about. The headlights off detail bothered me the most. That showed clear intention to hide what she was doing. She was trying to leave without Marcus noticing. She knew if she turned her headlights on right away, the brightness might wake him up or alert him she was leaving. So she'd back out in darkness. Only turn the lights on once she was far enough away that Marcus wouldn't notice. That's deliberate sneaking. That's hiding something. Marcus had no idea any of this was happening. He was completely oblivious. He worked such brutal hours that he was exhausted every night. He'd come home from the office around 9 or 10. He'd eat dinner, maybe watch TV for an hour. Then he'd go to bed around 11. He was so tired from working all day that he'd fall asleep immediately. He slept deeply through the night. He never knew his wife was getting out of bed at 2 a.m. and disappearing for 2 hours. I thought about telling Marcus what I'd discovered. But I knew how that conversation would go. He'd ask for proof. He'd want to know why I was watching his house at night. He'd probably accuse me of being paranoid or interfering. And without hard evidence of what Lisa was actually doing during those 2 hours, I couldn't prove anything. All I had was observation that she was leaving the house at night. She could claim she was going to the gym or the grocery store or anywhere. I needed to know where she was going and what she was doing. My suspicions about Lisa had evolved into certainty. I'd never trusted this woman from the day I met her. I'd sensed something fake about her, something calculating. She'd married Marcus for his money. She'd spent the last 2 years draining his finances and isolating him from family and friends. And now she was having an affair. She was betraying my son in the worst possible way. She was sleeping with someone else while Marcus worked himself to death to fund her expensive lifestyle. The rage I felt toward this woman was intense. She'd fooled my son. She'd manipulated him. She'd taken advantage of his trusting nature and his love for her. She was destroying him financially and emotionally. And he had no idea. He went to work every day thinking he had a loving wife at home. He bought her expensive things and paid for her luxurious lifestyle. He gave her everything she wanted, and she repaid him by sneaking out at night to betray him. I knew I needed to follow Lisa and see where she was going. I needed to catch her in the act. I needed evidence that would prove to Marcus what kind of woman he'd married. Evidence he couldn't deny or explain away. So I started planning how I would follow her without being detected. I needed to find out who she was meeting and what they were doing during those 2-hour sessions 3 times per week. Last Thursday, I made the decision that I was going to follow Lisa and find out where she was going. I couldn't just keep watching her leave and wondering. I needed answers. I needed proof of what she was doing. So I spent that entire day preparing. I made sure my old truck had gas. I checked that my phone was fully charged so I could record evidence if needed. I planned out how I'd follow her without being noticed. I knew Lisa's routine by now. She left at exactly 2 a.m. every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. So Thursday night, I went to bed early around 9 o'clock. I set my alarm for 1:30 in the morning. I wanted to be awake and ready before she started moving. When my alarm went off, I got dressed quickly. I put on dark clothes so I'd be less visible at night. I grabbed my phone and my keys. Then I went outside to my truck. I'd parked my truck on the street earlier that evening, instead of in my usual spot behind the guest house. I didn't want Lisa to notice it pulling out when she left. I wanted to blend in with other cars parked on the street. I sat in my truck with the lights off waiting. My heart was pounding. I felt nervous about what I was about to do. Following someone felt wrong. It felt like something a detective or stalker would do. But I needed to protect my son. I needed to know the truth. At exactly 2 o'clock, I saw Lisa's Mercedes backing out of their driveway. Right on schedule. Headlights off like always. She reached the street and turned right. Her headlights came on. She drove past where I was parked. I waited a few seconds to let her get a bit ahead. Then I started my truck and pulled out to follow her. I kept my distance. I didn't want her to notice me in her rearview mirror. Following someone at 2 in the morning is actually easier than during the day. There's almost no traffic on the roads, so I had to stay pretty far back to avoid being obvious. But the lack of other cars also meant I could see her easily. Her Mercedes had distinctive taillights that were easy to track. I followed her through our neighborhood and onto the main road heading toward downtown. She drove for about 15 minutes. I stayed several car lengths behind her the whole time. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. My heart was racing. I kept thinking about what I might discover. Where was she going? Who was she meeting? Was my suspicion about an affair correct, or was there some other explanation I hadn't considered? Lisa eventually turned into an upscale apartment complex on the edge of downtown. It was one of those modern buildings with expensive rent, the kind of place young professionals lived. She drove into the guest parking lot. I pulled over on the street outside the complex. I turned off my truck and watched. She parked her Mercedes in a visitor spot. Then she got out of the car. Lisa looked around carefully before walking toward the building. She was checking to make sure nobody was watching her. That confirmed this was something secretive, something she didn't want anyone to know about. She was dressed casually in jeans and a nice top, not like she was going to work out or run errands. She looked like she was going to visit someone. I watched her walk confidently toward one of the apartment buildings. She clearly knew exactly where she was going. This wasn't her first time here. She walked up to a ground floor unit. I could see the number on the door, but I was too far away to read it clearly. She knocked twice. A very specific knock, like a signal. Then she waited. A few seconds later, the door opened. I saw a man standing there. He was maybe in his 40s, average height and build, professional looking even though it was 2 in the morning. He smiled when he saw Lisa. Then he reached out and pulled her inside. The door closed behind them. And that was it. Lisa had disappeared into this man's apartment in the middle of the night while her husband slept at home. I sat in my truck feeling sick. My worst suspicions had been confirmed. Lisa was having an affair. She was cheating on Marcus. My son was working himself to death to support her expensive lifestyle. And she was repaying him by sleeping with some other man 3 times a week in a downtown apartment. The betrayal was complete. The woman I'd never trusted from day one had proven me right in the worst possible way. I waited in my truck trying to decide what to do next. Should I leave and come back later to see when she left? Should I stay and watch the whole time? Should I knock on that apartment door and confront her right now? My mind was racing with options, but I knew I needed evidence. I needed something concrete to show Marcus, something he couldn't deny or explain away. After sitting there for about 20 minutes, I decided to approach the apartment. I needed to see if I could hear anything. Maybe I could record something through the door. So I got out of my truck quietly. I walked across the parking lot toward the building. I moved slowly, trying not to make noise. I found the unit where Lisa had entered. I stood outside the door listening. I stood outside the apartment door trying to hear what was happening inside. The walls weren't very thick in these modern apartment buildings. I could hear muffled voices coming from inside the unit. A man's voice and Lisa's voice. They were talking, but I couldn't make out the words clearly. I pressed my ear against the door trying to hear better. I needed to know what they were saying. I needed evidence of what was happening. The voices got slightly louder, like they'd moved closer to the door. I could start making out words now. The man said something about being glad she could make it. Lisa laughed. It was a relaxed, comfortable laugh. Not the fake, polite laugh she used around Marcus and his family. This was genuine. She was comfortable with this man. They clearly knew each other well. This wasn't a first meeting. This was a relationship that had been going on for a while. Then I heard the man's voice more clearly. He said something that made my blood run cold. "Did you finish moving the funds like we discussed?" My heart stopped. Funds? What funds? What were they talking about? This wasn't just an affair. This was something more. I pulled out my phone immediately. I opened the voice recording app. I started recording everything I could hear through that door. Lisa's voice came through clearer now. Yes, I moved another 100,000 this week. We're getting close to the target. Once we hit 2 million in the offshore account, we can initiate the divorce and disappear before Marcus realizes what's missing. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. They weren't just having an affair. They were stealing from Marcus. They were planning to rob him and run away together. This was so much worse than I'd imagined. The man spoke again. This time I recognized his voice. It was Derek Chen, Marcus's chief financial officer. The man Marcus had hired 2 years ago to manage the company's finances. The man Marcus trusted completely with all the financial operations of his business. Derek had access to everything: company accounts, financial records, passwords, everything, and he was using that access to steal from Marcus while sleeping with his wife. I stood there with my phone pressed against the door recording everything. My hand was shaking. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My son had been betrayed by the 2 people he trusted most in the world: his wife and his CFO. They'd been working together to systematically rob him, planning to take millions of dollars and disappear together, leaving Marcus with nothing but a failed marriage and a destroyed business. Derek's voice continued. We need to be careful. Another 100,000 per week should work. Small enough that it won't trigger any audit alarms. Large enough that we'll hit our target in about 3 weeks. Then we file for divorce. You claim irreconcilable differences. We wait for the divorce to process. Then we disappear to Costa Rica, where the property is already waiting under our fake names. They had it all planned out. Every detail. They'd been working on this scheme for months, maybe longer. They had offshore accounts, fake identities, property in Costa Rica. This wasn't some impulsive decision. This was calculated and deliberate. They'd been stealing from Marcus for a long time, slowly draining his company's accounts, setting up their escape, planning their new life together, funded by money stolen from my son. Lisa laughed again, that same comfortable, genuine laugh. I can't believe how easy this has been. Marcus is so trusting. He never questions anything I do. He works such long hours, he doesn't pay attention to the finances anymore. He just assumes everything is fine. It's almost too easy to fool him. Her words were like knives. She was mocking my son, laughing about how gullible he was, how easy he was to deceive and rob. Derek agreed. He's the same at work, completely trusting. He gave me full access to all the financial systems, never checks my work, never audits anything. He's so focused on the big picture client relationships that he doesn't look at the details. I've been creating fake vendor accounts and consulting fees for 18 months. All the money goes to accounts I control. Then I transfer it to our offshore setup. He has no idea millions are missing. 18 months. They'd been stealing from Marcus for a year and a half, since right after Derek was hired. This had been their plan from the beginning. Derek had probably specifically sought out a job with Marcus's company, knowing he could exploit the access. And Lisa had been feeding him information, giving him Marcus's passwords, helping him access systems that should have been secure. They were partners in crime, destroying my son together. The conversation continued. They talked about how stupid Marcus was, how he deserved this for being so trusting and naive. They laughed about his long work hours, about how exhausted he always was, about how he was killing himself building a business they were stealing from him. They had no remorse, no guilt, no conscience. They were evil people taking advantage of a good man who'd done nothing but trust them and treat them well. I kept my phone pressed against the door, recording everything. My heart was pounding. Sweat was running down my face. I was trying to stay quiet so they wouldn't hear me outside. But inside, I was screaming. I wanted to break down that door. I wanted to confront them. I wanted to make them pay for what they were doing to Marcus. But I forced myself to stay calm, to keep recording. I needed evidence. I needed proof that would hold up and save my son. I stood outside that apartment door for almost 40 minutes with my phone pressed against the wood, recording everything Derek and Lisa said. They talked freely, thinking they were completely alone and safe. They had no idea Marcus's father was standing right outside, listening to every word of their conspiracy. They laid out the entire scheme in detail. How they'd met, how long they'd been stealing, exactly how much money they'd taken, what their plans were for the future. Derek explained how he'd gotten hired at Marcus's company specifically for this purpose. He'd researched successful tech consulting firms in the area. He'd identified Marcus's company as a target because it was profitable and growing but didn't have strong financial oversight. Marcus was so focused on client relationships and business development that he didn't pay close attention to the accounting details. He trusted his CFO to handle that side of things. That trust had been a fatal mistake. Derek had submitted a fake resume with credentials that looked impressive but couldn't be fully verified. He'd lied about his previous experience and education. But Marcus hadn't done thorough background checks. He'd been impressed by Derek's interview and his apparent knowledge of financial systems, so he'd hired him as CFO, giving him complete access to all company finances. Derek had started stealing within the first month on the job. The method Derek used was sophisticated, but not unusual for embezzlement. He created fake vendor accounts that looked legitimate on paper. He'd generate invoices for consulting services or software purchases that never actually happened. Then he'd approve those invoices and transfer company money to accounts he controlled. The amounts were small enough that they didn't raise immediate red flags. A few thousand here, 5,000 there. But over 18 months, those small amounts added up to massive theft. Lisa's role in the scheme was equally important. She provided Derek with access to Marcus's personal information and passwords. She'd convinced Marcus to keep important documents at home where she could photograph them. She'd learned his computer passwords by watching him type. She'd given Derek access to systems that should have been secure. Without Lisa's help from inside the marriage, Derek wouldn't have been able to steal nearly as much as he had. They talked about their relationship too. The affair had started about 6 months after Derek was hired. They'd been working closely on the embezzlement scheme and had developed feelings for each other. Or at least that's what they told themselves. More likely they were just two terrible people who recognized each other and decided to partner up to rob my son. The affair gave them more opportunities to meet and plan without raising suspicion. Lisa described how easy it was to sneak out at night. She said Marcus slept so heavily from exhaustion that he never noticed when she left the bed. She said his sleeping medication helped too. She could slip out at 2 in the morning, drive to Derek's apartment, spend 2 hours with him, then come back and Marcus would be none the wiser. She'd been doing this 3 times per week for over a year, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday nights like clockwork. Derek mentioned how they'd already purchased property in Costa Rica under fake identities. They'd been planning this escape for months. They had new passports with different names. They had bank accounts set up in the Cayman Islands where the stolen money was being funneled. They had plane tickets booked for 3 weeks from now. Everything was ready. They just needed to finish stealing the final amounts to hit their $2 million target. The plan after that was brutal in its simplicity. Lisa would file for divorce, claiming Marcus had become distant and their marriage was beyond repair. She'd demand her fair share of assets in the divorce. While that was processing, she and Derek would continue stealing as much as possible. Then right before the divorce was finalized, they'd disappear. They'd fly to Costa Rica. They'd live in their beach property under their fake names. They'd never have to work again. They'd have $2 million stolen from Marcus, plus whatever Lisa got in the divorce settlement. They talked about how Marcus would probably lose everything. His marriage would be destroyed. His company would be bankrupt from the embezzlement. His reputation would be ruined. He'd probably have to declare bankruptcy. They laughed about this. They actually laughed about destroying a good man's entire life. Lisa said something about how Marcus deserved it for being so naive and trusting. Derek agreed, saying Marcus should have been smarter about protecting his assets. The cruelty and callousness of their conversation was stunning. These weren't people who'd made a mistake or let temptation overcome them. These were predators. They'd deliberately targeted Marcus. They'd planned this destruction from the beginning. They felt no guilt or remorse. They actually felt entitled to steal from him, like he deserved to be robbed because he'd been foolish enough to trust his wife and his CFO. I heard them moving toward what sounded like the bedroom area of the apartment. Their voices got more intimate and quiet. I didn't want to hear what happened next. I had enough evidence. I had their full confession recorded on my phone. I had proof of the affair and the embezzlement and their plans to flee the country. This recording would destroy them both. It would save Marcus from losing everything. It would expose them for the criminals they were. I quietly backed away from the apartment door. I walked back to my truck trying to process everything I'd just learned. My suspicions about Lisa had been completely validated. She was even worse than I'd imagined. She hadn't just married Marcus for money. She'd married him specifically to rob him. She'd brought in an accomplice. They'd been systematically destroying my son's life together for over a year, and they'd been planning to finish the job and disappear with millions of his dollars. I sat in my truck in that parking lot for another hour, listening to the recording I'd made through my headphones. I wanted to make sure I'd captured everything clearly. I wanted to verify that the audio quality was good enough to understand what they were saying. I played it back from the beginning. Derek's voice came through clearly talking about moving funds. Lisa's voice responding about the $2 million target. Every word of their conspiracy was captured on my phone. The recording was almost 40 minutes long. I'd started recording the moment I heard them mention moving funds. I'd kept it running the entire time they discussed their scheme. The audio had some muffled parts where they'd moved away from the door, but the important parts were crystal clear. Their confession about embezzling from Marcus's company, their plan to steal $2 million, their intention to flee to Costa Rica, their fake identities and offshore accounts. All of it was documented. I listened to the part where Derek explained how he'd been creating fake vendor accounts and consulting fees. He described the process in detail, how he'd set up shell companies with business names that sounded legitimate, how he'd generate invoices that looked real, how he'd route the money through multiple accounts to hide the trail, how he'd been doing this for 18 months without Marcus suspecting anything. The sophistication of the scheme was impressive in a terrible way. Lisa's part in the conspiracy was equally detailed in the recording. She talked about how she'd gotten Marcus's passwords by watching him type them in at home. She mentioned photographing important documents from his home office when he was at work. She described giving Derek access to Marcus's email so he could impersonate him to approve fraudulent transactions. She'd been systematically betraying her husband's trust to facilitate the theft. The recording captured them discussing specific amounts they'd stolen. Derek mentioned they'd taken about $1,700,000 so far. They needed another $300,000 to reach their $2 million goal. They planned to accelerate the theft over the next 3 weeks. They were confident they could hit the target before Marcus or anyone else noticed the missing money. Then they'd initiate their escape plan. I heard them talk about the Costa Rica property they'd purchased. Derek said it was a beautiful beach house in a quiet area. They'd bought it under fake names through a local attorney who didn't ask questions. They'd paid cash using money from earlier thefts. The property was ready and waiting for them. They'd furnished it. They had local bank accounts set up. Everything was prepared for their new life together. The fake identities were another crucial detail captured in the recording. Lisa would become Rebecca Martinez. Derek would become Michael Torres. They had complete documentation including passports and driver's licenses. They'd worked with some kind of identity fraud specialist who'd created these personas for them. They talked about how excited they were to start fresh with new names in a country where nobody knew them. Their discussion about the divorce strategy was particularly cruel. Lisa explained she'd file claiming irreconcilable differences and emotional abandonment. She'd paint Marcus as a workaholic who neglected their marriage. She'd demand half of all marital assets, which would include the house and any accounts she could access. She'd drag out the divorce process as long as possible to give them time to steal more. Then she'd settle quickly and disappear before Marcus realized what was really happening. Derek and Lisa also discussed what would happen to Marcus after they left. They predicted he'd be financially destroyed. His company would collapse once the embezzlement was discovered. He'd have to lay off all his employees. He'd probably have to declare bankruptcy. His professional reputation would be ruined. Nobody would trust him with their business after losing millions to fraud. His career would be over. They talked about all of this with amusement, like they were discussing a movie plot instead of a real person's life they were destroying. The recording captured them mocking Marcus's trusting nature. Lisa said he was naive and gullible. Derek said he was careless and stupid for not monitoring his own finances better. They both agreed he deserved what was happening because he should have been smarter. They felt no guilt about stealing from him. They felt no remorse about destroying his life. They actually seemed to think they were justified in taking advantage of his trust. I heard them discuss their relationship too. How they'd fallen in love while planning the theft. How exciting it was to have a secret life together. How they couldn't wait to be together permanently in Costa Rica. Lisa talked about how much happier she was with Derek than she'd ever been with Marcus. She said Marcus was boring and predictable. Derek was exciting and adventurous. They were perfect for each other. They deserved to be together. They deserved the life they were stealing. The final part of the recording was them making plans for the next few weeks. They discussed how much to steal each week, when to make the transfers, how to cover their tracks, when Lisa would file for divorce, when they'd book their final flights to Costa Rica. They went through their timeline step by step. They were confident and excited. They thought they'd planned everything perfectly. They thought they were going to get away with it. I turned off the recording and sat in my truck feeling a mix of rage and determination. These two people had conspired to destroy my son. They'd been systematically robbing him for 18 months. They'd stolen $1,700,000 already. They planned to steal $300,000 more. They were going to divorce him and disappear, leaving him bankrupt and ruined. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd done all their planning out loud in an apartment with thin walls, while Marcus's father stood outside recording everything. I drove back to the guest house around 4:30 in the morning. I was exhausted but running on pure adrenaline. I couldn't sleep even if I wanted to. My mind was racing with everything I'd discovered. I kept replaying that recording in my head. Derek and Lisa's voices discussing their conspiracy, their plan to rob Marcus blind and disappear, their complete lack of guilt or remorse. I was furious, but I was also relieved. I had evidence. I had proof. I could save my son. I knew I needed to tell Marcus immediately. I couldn't wait. Every day I delayed was another day they were stealing from him, another day closer to them hitting their $2 million target and disappearing. I needed to act fast, but I also needed to be smart about how I presented this information. Marcus loved Lisa. He trusted Derek. He wasn't going to want to believe what I was about to tell him. I needed to make sure he listened. I decided to wait until morning when Marcus would be having his coffee before work. That was around 7 a.m. He had a routine where he'd sit at the kitchen table drinking coffee and checking emails before heading to the office. That would be the perfect time to approach him. He'd be awake and alert. We'd have privacy before Lisa woke up. I could show him the evidence without her interfering or making excuses. I spent the next 2.5 hours sitting in my guest house going over my plan. I transferred the recording from my phone to my computer as a backup. I made sure it was saved in multiple places so it couldn't be lost or deleted. This recording was everything. It was the evidence that would expose Derek and Lisa. It was the proof that would save Marcus's company and his future. I couldn't risk anything happening to it. At 6:45 in the morning, I saw lights come on in the main house. Marcus was up. I waited another 15 minutes to make sure he'd had time to make his coffee and settle in. Then I walked over to the main house. My heart was pounding. I was nervous about how Marcus would react, but I knew this had to be done. I knocked on the kitchen door. Marcus opened it, looking surprised to see me so early. "Dad? What are you doing up? Is everything okay?" He looked concerned. I must have looked terrible. I hadn't slept. I was stressed and anxious. I probably looked like I was having a medical emergency. I told him I was fine, but I needed to talk to him urgently. It couldn't wait. Marcus let me in. He poured me a cup of coffee. We sat down at his kitchen table, the same table where he'd been sitting when Lisa was at Derek's apartment betraying him. I took a deep breath and looked at my son. "Marcus, I need you to listen to something before you go to work. Don't interrupt. Don't react. Just listen to the entire thing. Then we'll talk about what to do." Marcus looked confused but nodded. He asked if I was okay, if I needed help with something. I told him I was fine, but what I was about to show him would change everything. He needed to prepare himself. I pulled out my phone. I opened the recording. I placed the phone on the table between us. Then I pressed play. Derek's voice came through the speaker talking about moving funds. Marcus's face immediately showed confusion. He didn't recognize the voice at first. Then Lisa's voice came through talking about hitting the $2 million target. Marcus went pale. He recognized his wife's voice. He looked at me with shock and horror. I told him to keep listening, to hear the whole thing. Marcus sat there frozen as the recording played, Derek talking about the embezzlement scheme, Lisa talking about giving him access to Marcus's passwords, their discussion about fake vendor accounts and offshore accounts, their plan to flee to Costa Rica, their timeline for the divorce. All of it played out while Marcus listened, with his face getting more devastated with each passing minute. The recording was almost 40 minutes long. Marcus sat through the entire thing without moving, without speaking. His coffee got cold sitting untouched in front of him. His face cycled through emotions: shock, disbelief, hurt, anger, betrayal. He heard his wife and his CFO laughing about how stupid and trusting he was, mocking him for working long hours while they stole from him, planning his financial destruction while pretending to love him and work for him. When the recording finally ended, Marcus just sat there staring at the phone. His face was completely pale. His hands were shaking. He looked like he'd been physically struck. He whispered my name but couldn't form other words. I reached over and put my hand on his shoulder. I told him I was so sorry, that I'd suspected Lisa was cheating and had followed her, that I'd discovered it was so much worse than an affair, that they'd been systematically robbing him for over a year. Marcus finally found his voice. "How long have you known?" His voice was broken, raw. I told him I'd only discovered the late-night departures 3 weeks ago, that I'd followed her last night and recorded this conversation, that I'd come to him immediately. I hadn't known about the embezzlement. I'd thought it was just an affair. But what I'd discovered was a complete conspiracy to destroy him. Marcus asked if I was sure the recording was real, if it was really Lisa and Derek. I told him to listen again to their voices. He knew Derek's voice. He knew his wife's voice. There was no mistaking it. Marcus put his head in his hands. He started crying. My successful, confident son broke down at his kitchen table. His wife had betrayed him. His trusted employee had robbed him. The two people he relied on most had conspired to destroy everything he'd built. Marcus pulled himself together after about 10 minutes of crying at the kitchen table. He wiped his face. He took some deep breaths. Then he looked at me with a hardness in his eyes I'd never seen before. The shock and hurt were being replaced by determination and anger. He said we needed to call his lawyer immediately. We needed to get law enforcement involved. We needed to stop Derek and Lisa before they could steal any more money or disappear with what they'd already taken. I agreed completely. Time was critical. According to the recording, they planned to steal another $300,000 over the next 3 weeks. Then they'd file for divorce and flee to Costa Rica. We had maybe 3 weeks maximum to stop them. Marcus called his corporate attorney at home, even though it was only 7:30 in the morning. The lawyer answered, sounding annoyed about being called so early. Marcus told him it was an emergency. He needed to come to the house immediately. It was about fraud and embezzlement. The lawyer arrived within 40 minutes. Marcus played him the recording I'd made. The lawyer listened with increasing alarm. When it finished, he said this was serious criminal activity. This wasn't just a civil matter that could be handled through lawsuits. This was felony fraud and embezzlement. They needed to involve law enforcement immediately. He also said they needed a forensic accountant to examine the company books and trace all the stolen money. By 9 in the morning, Marcus's kitchen was full of people. The lawyer, a forensic accountant the lawyer had called, a detective from the financial crimes unit. They all listened to my recording. They all asked questions about Derek and Lisa, when I'd discovered the late-night trips, how I'd followed her, how I'd recorded the conversation through the apartment door. The detective said the recording was admissible evidence. I hadn't broken any laws recording a conversation I'd overheard. It was legal and useful. The forensic accountant asked for immediate access to the company's financial systems. Marcus logged him into everything right there at the kitchen table. The accountant started pulling reports and transaction histories. He said it would take several hours to do a full analysis, but he'd look for the most obvious red flags first. The fake vendor accounts Derek had mentioned. The suspicious transfers. the pattern of small thefts that added up over time. By noon, the forensic accountant had preliminary findings. He'd found approximately $1.7 million in fraudulent transfers over the past 18 months. Exactly like Derek and Lisa had said in the recording. The money had been funneled through fake vendor accounts and consulting fees. It had been transferred to shell companies. From there, it had been moved to offshore accounts. The trail was complex but traceable. The accountant said he could document everything within a few days. The detective said they had enough evidence to arrest both Derek and Lisa immediately. The recording provided probable cause. The forensic accounting would provide additional proof. He said he'd coordinate with the district attorney's office to get arrest warrants issued. They'd move quickly before Derek or Lisa suspected anything. The goal was to catch them completely by surprise so they couldn't flee or destroy evidence. Marcus asked what would happen to them. The detective said they were looking at serious felony charges: embezzlement, fraud, money laundering, conspiracy. Each charge carried significant prison time. If convicted, they could be looking at 7 to 10 years each, maybe more depending on how the charges were structured. They'd also be required to repay the stolen money. Their lives were basically over. The arrests happened that evening around 6 o'clock. The police coordinated it carefully. They arrested Derek at his apartment, the same apartment where I'd recorded him confessing to the crimes. They arrested Lisa at the mansion when she came back from having lunch with her friends. Marcus wasn't home when they arrested her. He'd stayed away deliberately. He didn't want to see her, didn't want to hear her excuses or lies. He let the police handle it. I was there when they took Lisa away in handcuffs. She looked shocked and terrified. She kept asking what was happening, what she was being arrested for. The police told her she was being charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and embezzlement. She immediately asked for a lawyer. She didn't say anything else. They put her in the police car and drove away. I watched, feeling satisfied. She'd tried to destroy my son. Now she was the one being destroyed. The next few months were a legal nightmare. Derek and Lisa both got lawyers and tried to fight the charges, but the evidence against them was overwhelming. My recording. The forensic accounting showing $1.7 million in theft. Bank records tracing the money to offshore accounts. Documents showing the fake identities and Costa Rica property. They had no defense. Eventually, they both took plea deals to avoid trial. Derek was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. Lisa got 5 years. They also had to repay all the stolen money, though most of it was recovered during the investigation. The offshore accounts were seized. The Costa Rica property was sold. Marcus got back about $1.5 million of what they'd stolen. The other $200,000 was gone in fees and expenses. But at least he recovered most of it. Marcus's marriage ended in handcuffs and federal fraud charges. His wife went to prison. His CFO went to prison. He lost 2 people he'd trusted completely, but he saved his company. The forensic accountant estimated Derek and Lisa would have stolen another $6.3 million if they'd continued for a few more years. My intervention had saved Marcus from total financial ruin. His business survived. His reputation survived. He rebuilt with new employees he screened more carefully. Marcus thanked me repeatedly for following Lisa that night, for recording the evidence, for saving him from losing everything. He said if I hadn't been suspicious and taken action, he'd have lost his company, his savings, and his future. Derek and Lisa would be living in Costa Rica with his money, laughing about how they'd fooled him. Instead, they were in prison. Justice had been served. I'd saved my son.